Welcome to Chapter 12, Police Work with Juveniles. Having specialized juvenile units in police services is really a recent phenomenon. In American colonies, local sheriffs were the most important police official. And by the mid-1800s, city police departments had formed in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Juvenile aid bureaus organized by the police started in the 1930s in Berkeley, California by August Vollmer. And now most urban law enforcement agencies have specialized juvenile police programs. Recently, a new view of policing has emerged among the police. And this concept is that the police role should be to maintain order and be visible and accessible to the community. This has been referred to as community policing. So, working with juvenile offenders may be really challenging and difficult and emotional for police officers. But when we're putting them into the communities, these officers into the community with community policing, it really allows them a chance to become connected to the community and therefore connected to the children in the community. So police roles have many different jobs, and we're not going to get too much into this, but I do want to talk about juvenile officers and how they operate. So sometimes they'll operate as like a specialist in the police department or as part of a juvenile unit specifically. And most juvenile officers are appointed after they have some sort of patrol experience. There has to be some aptitude and desire to work with juveniles to want to be in this role. And there can be conflict that can occur with this desire to perform this primary duty of enforcing the law, and then also having this need in the rehabilitation of youthful offenders. Officers must consider what is in the best interest of the child and how their actions will influence the future well-being of the child. Violent juvenile offenders are defined as those that are adjudicated or convicted for crimes of homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and kidnapping. And those juveniles account for 11% of all violent crimes. So my experience as a juvenile officer was basically put into the juvenile unit, which was essentially a special victims unit. And I really totally agree with what our lecture notes are saying, that you have to really find that fine line between wanting to help and serve these juveniles and also being able to continue to enforce the law. It does take someone who has that desire to be there. You can't just put any officer into a juvenile unit. That would not be successful. Police experiment with various methods of violent juvenile crime control. There's different directed controls, protective arrests, different types of problem-oriented policing that goes on. It's just like any other special unit. You have to learn what's going to work the best with juvenile offenders. There's a few graphics here that you should be able to go through and look at. So police involvement with juvenile offenders is controlled by statute, constitutional case law, and justice reviews, just like anything else. Police methods of investigation and control will include the arrest procedures, search and seizure, and custodial interrogation. So with the arrest procedure, most states require that the law of arrest be the same for both adults and juveniles. Officers must have probable cause. And probable cause is reasonable ground to believe that an offense was committed and that the accused committed that offense. But police have broader latitude to arrest juveniles, and statutes give the police the authority to act in loco parentis, which is Latin for in place of the parent. and it basically serves as a basis of taking the juvenile into custody. As far as search and seizure is concerned, courts have held that the Fourth Amendment ban against unreasonable search and seizure, and that applies to juveniles, and any illegally seized evidence is inadmissible, no different than in an adult arrest. As far as custodial interrogation, Miranda, which I believe all of you have taken CJ 101, and we know that Miranda in 1966 was the Supreme Court ruling that placed constitutional limitations on police interrogations. And juveniles have the same rights as adults against self-incrimination. So there are some other case law that we have come in contact with as well that you can see on your slides. So in Re of Galt, 1967, and this talks about those constitutional privileges against self-incrimination for juveniles. And most courts hold that parents or attorneys need not be present for children to effectively waive their rights. But the general rule is that juveniles can waive their right to protection from self-incrimination, but the validity of that waiver is determined on a case-by-case basis. So juvenile offenders really receive nearly as much procedural discretion as adult offenders. Police have a broader authority when they're dealing with juveniles. Police discretion is selective enforcement of the law by authorized police agents. And police officers have a choice among numerous possible courses of action within the limits, of course, of their power and authority when we're talking about juveniles. So a study suggests that 64% of police contacts with juveniles is handled informally. And another study suggests that 13% of police encounters with juveniles result in arrest. And there are very varying reasons why and factors that might play a role in this. So environmental factors are, the norms of the community affecting the decision of the officer. If there's liberal environments versus conservative communities, those can vary in how police may use their discretion. But customs of local police also influence decision directives and instructing officers to be alert to certain types of juvenile violations. There's also situational factors that come up, and that could be factors attached to particular crime, such as specific traits of offenders. It might include demeanors and appearance, maybe dress or attitude, speech, level of hostility towards the police. So there's all sorts of things that can come into play. And of course, we have to look at bias and police discretion. That can definitely play a role as well, whether it's racial bias, gender bias, organizational bias. That does play a role. But let's look at this question. Do police allow bias to affect their arrest decisions with juveniles? Racial bias is definitely present in the system. We know that. I'm not going to get too much into this. This is a huge topic with Black Lives Matter and different protests that have been going on. So I'm going to leave this with you to form your own opinions, but we do know that there is some racial bias that occurs in the whole criminal justice system, not just when we're dealing with youth. On to even more important topics. Let's talk about delinquency prevention and what the police can and may do. Police are have really taken a lead in delinquency prevention. Some are using deterrent powers and positive relationships in schools, in the community, and other juvenile justice agencies. And then, of course, there is aggressive law enforcement. And this is getting into those targeted areas, being highly visible as law enforcement, arresting for minor and serious infractions, getting these kids to start to think. We're also putting police into schools with our school resource officers, and this is a collaboration with school staff and to help create safer school environments and also to develop programs to meet that goal. And then, of course, community policing is a huge thing. This engages citizens and community-based organizations in order to gain the trust and assistance of the concerned citizens. And the Law Enforcement Management and Administration Statistics Survey reports that 7 out of 10 local police departments include a community policing component. Another big push in law enforcement is problem-oriented policing. And so this is a process of analysis and response to problems underlying criminal incidents. Looking at the community, engaging with the community, engaging with other juvenile justice agencies. A process called SARA, which is a 4-STEM model, stands for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment. It has definitely been a successful application for many agencies. Boston had Operation Ceasefire that had a very good response, and that was a partnership to reduce juvenile gun violence. So what's the future look like for juvenile policing? There are many associated with addressing juvenile offenders. We have to look at all of these possible things that could play into the work with juveniles. The use of soft technologies such as IT systems, closed circuit televisions, different types of technology to get into the schools and get into the communities to really see what's going on. But we want to really focus on these new approaches of community-based policing, policing in schools, and thus to help get down to the nitty-gritty of working with these kids. I think what's really important is from this lecture, one thing I always take is that there's no difference really in what law enforcement agencies are doing when we're talking about working with kids. The kids that are committing the most heinous crimes, violent crimes, are not the same kids that are skipping school or tagging up the side of a building, usually. And so I think prevention is key, getting in at a young age and stopping these kids from being that top 11% of violent criminal offenders that are juveniles. Have a great night.